Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're zeroing in on a profound and, honestly, frequently overlooked institutional failure. We're talking about the mistreatment of the mentally ill within our county legal and carceral systems. We are going to look at some extensive, verified data, dive into federal court dockets, and look at grand jury reports from across California. We really want to see exactly how these systems are breaking down, the real human cost of these failures, and the absolutely staggering financial burden that ultimately falls right onto the taxpayers.
Okay, let's dive into this. Across the country, but especially in under-resourced rural counties, municipalities have essentially outsourced their mental health care directly to the penal system. Think about it. When communities lack dedicated psychiatric beds or proper crisis intervention resources, the default response to a mental health emergency just becomes a 911 call, a squad car, and a jail cell. But a jail is definitely not a hospital, and correctional officers are not psychiatrists. So what happens when we force one system to do the job of the other?
To figure out how this happens, we'll follow the data through a quick roadmap. First, frontline mental health crisis. Second, the privatized care crisis. Third, weaponizing the safety cell. Fourth, incompetence in the courtroom. And finally, the staggering taxpayer toll.
Because, look, an individual in psychiatric distress doesn't just experience one isolated point of failure. It's more like they're funneled through this tragic institutional pipeline. It starts right at the arrest, moves to jail intake, progresses deep into custodial care, and then finally ends up in the courtroom. Each successive institution just compounds the tragedy, stripping away another layer of protection until, honestly, catastrophic outcomes are almost guaranteed.
Let's start with Section 1, Frontline Mental Health Crises.
Let's examine what actually happens during those critical initial encounters with law enforcement out on the streets. And to ground this data, let's look at a real documented case from Tuolumne County. Michael Dillman was a 63-year-old Vietnam veteran. During an arrest over a totally minor dispute, he explicitly told the deputy that he suffered from severe PTSD and claustrophobia. He literally made a direct plea for accommodation, just asking for the cruiser windows to be cracked and his cuffs loosened a bit to prevent a PTSD episode. But instead of therapeutic de-escalation, the records show the deputy cursed at him, rolled up the windows, and threatened to hog-tie his ass. That immediately triggered a severe hour-long PTSD episode. It's just a staggering example of how a medical vulnerability is met with punitive authority rather than actual care.
And this brilliantly illustrates the lethal mechanics of how these frontline encounters can escalate. Let's trace a timeline from Shasta County involving Thomas Barboza, a combat veteran. Okay, minute 1, his wife calls 911 explicitly asking for medical aid because he's experiencing PTSD-induced psychosis. This is a cry for a doctor, right? But by minute 15, deputies have initiated a high-speed pursuit over expired tags. At minute 30, Barboza's truck rolls over down a steep hill. He's totally disoriented, trapped in the cab. And at minute 35, instead of de-escalating the situation, law enforcement deploys a K9 dog into the cab, and a SWAT sniper fatally shoots him with an assault rifle from over 30 feet away. A call for psychiatric help somehow ended in a tactical, lethal strike. And if a person actually manages to survive their arrest, well, they move to the next harrowing phase.
Which brings us to Section 2, the privatized care crisis.
The structural void in a lot of these regions is absolutely massive. Take Siskiyou County, for example. They completely lack designated, appropriate psychiatric facilities for citizens in crisis. None. So law enforcement is forced to rely on local emergency rooms that openly admit they can't handle psychiatric care, or they just drop folks off at the jail. And the result? Totally preventable tragedies like Matthew Anderson. He was a 28-year-old with a heavily documented history of schizophrenia. A court had actually ordered him to a state hospital, but due to this massive structural void and extreme delays, he was left in a fundamentally unequipped environment, which resulted in his preventable suicide.
Now, what's really interesting and frankly chilling about this next piece of data is the deliberate indifference exposed inside these privatized custodial settings. This is straight from a massive lawsuit in Shasta County involving a private healthcare contractor. Randall Johnson, a man going through a severe mental health crisis, swallowed a lethal amount of methamphetamine in a suicide attempt right as he was being arrested. At the jail, a private nurse deliberately falsified his intake form, checking no for drug use, even though Johnson and the arresting officer explicitly stated he had ingested massive amounts of meth. Instead of paying to transport him to a hospital, they literally just put him in a cell. The lawsuit noted deputies were actually heard laughing as he slowly died of an overdose over the course of 2 days.
When we look closely at the data, this really tragic pattern emerges. I mean, why does a nurse falsify an intake form to avoid a hospital trip in the first place? Well, it all comes down to the business model. Counties routinely contract this work out to private equity-owned healthcare companies like WellPath and CFMG. grand jury reports, and federal lawsuits consistently point out that their profit margins rely heavily on cost containment. And how do you contain costs? Easy. You minimize staff. You use under-credentialed licensed vocational nurses instead of registered nurses. You avoid expensive emergency room transports at all costs. This creates a systemic risk vector where severe, life-threatening psychiatric and medical crises are simply ignored to protect the bottom line. And when jails don't have the staff or even the desire to treat mental illness, they fall back on architectural isolation.
Let's look at Section 3, weaponizing the safety cell.
There is a stark, undeniable contrast here. Clinically speaking, a safety cell is supposed to be a therapeutic, padded environment designed to protect an actively suicidal person from self-harm until real help arrives. But the punitive reality documented in countless lawsuits across California, it's entirely different. Detainees are routinely stripped naked, forced into these heavy safety smocks, and thrown into isolation cells that are often coated in urine or feces. And once inside, because the jail is so heavily understaffed, they're frequently just ignored, completely bypassing the mandatory 15-minute welfare checks required by law.
The human cost of weaponizing these cells is devastating. In Shasta County, Jordan Deepy, a severely mentally ill pretrial detainee, was subjected to punitive solitary confinement, which directly contributed to his suicide. In Yuba County, Bertram Hiscock, a bipolar detainee, was locked in a padded cell with nothing but a floor grate. He literally choked to death on his own feces while guards entirely ignored him banging on the door for help. In Tuolumne County, Grant Hewlett was forced to strip and wear a safety smock, followed by the use of excessive force, simply because he showed some verbal frustration during his booking. The safety protocol has basically become an instrument of psychological torture and lethal neglect. Now, you might think that once a detainee finally makes it before a judge, their constitutional rights will kick in and protect them, but unfortunately, the data shows otherwise.
Moving on to Section 4, incompetence in the courtroom.
So the crucial point here revolves around this single number, 70%. In Shasta County, a contract public defender named Jack Suter was actually documented boasting that he pled 70% of his clients guilty at their very first court appearance, often after spending barely 30 seconds with them. Now, when you're dealing with clients experiencing severe psychiatric impairment, 30 seconds is barely enough time to learn a person's name, let alone properly evaluate their competency to stand trial.
And this happens because of the flat-fee public defense consortium model used by a lot of these counties. Rather than funding a robust public defender's office with dedicated social workers and investigators, counties just pay contractors a flat rate to handle indigent defense. Mathematically, this disincentivizes spending time on complex mental health cases. Doing the really hard work of securing a psychiatric evaluation, fighting for a hospital placement, or restoring competency, well, that costs the attorney time and money. So the financial incentive is to plead the mentally ill citizen guilty as quickly as possible, completely stripping away their Sixth Amendment rights to due process. And these aren't just moral or human rights failures, folks. They're massive financial liabilities that local communities are ultimately forced to bear.
Let's move to and see how this builds in Section 5, the staggering taxpayer toll.
When we examine the litigation registry, the verified settlements from just recent years are absolutely staggering. Look at this. The Katherine Johnson meth overdose case, settled for $12.5 million. The Thomas Barboza canine and sniper shooting, a $12 million payout. In Mendocino County, the restraint asphyxia death of James Neuroth resulted in a $5 million settlement. That is nearly $30 million lost across just 3 cases. When counties fail to provide constitutional levels of care, plaintiff attorneys step in and secure massive payouts. And where exactly does all that money come from?
It comes from the taxpayers, and it's driven by a legal concept called Monell liability. Basically, because of federal court precedents, like Brewster v. County of Shasta, counties can't just throw their hands up and blame a rogue deputy or a bad nurse. If a civil rights violation occurs because of an established custom, a written policy, or a systemic failure to adequately train staff, the municipality itself is held financially responsible. The county is entirely on the hook.
To put that into perspective, the scale of these financial penalties is breathtaking. When a county has to pay out a $12 million settlement, it rapidly drains municipal risk pools. Now, counties rely on excess insurance pools like PRISM to absorb these shocks, but when the payouts become this frequent and this huge, insurance premiums absolutely skyrocket. And those increased premiums? They are paid directly out of the county's general fund. That's money that should be going to local roads, schools, and, ironically enough, actual mental health diversion programs.
So how do counties fix this mess? Well, a lot of the time they don't. They just try to buy a bigger shield. Recently, Shasta County severed ties with their medical provider, WellPath, after a cluster of high-profile jail deaths. But instead of bringing medical care in-house or actually fixing the root oversight issues, they signed a $25 million contract with a brand-new private provider, Medico, paying a 40% premium to do so. Financial analysis of this move indicates this functions practically as an insurance premium against future Monell claims. They are strategically outsourcing the risk, passing the ultimate financial burden right back to the taxpayers, all without actually addressing the systemic failure of the system itself.
Which leaves us with a final and honestly highly critical question to consider. We've seen the whole pipeline today, from excessive force on the streets to falsified medical records and punitive solitary confinement in the jails, all the way to 30-second guilty pleas in the courtroom, all of it culminating in tens of millions of taxpayer dollars lost to civil lawsuits. Knowing the devastating human cost and the crushing financial reality we just went through, is outsourcing our mental health care to the penal system a sustainable model for any community? Take that question with you and consider how we might all demand better, more humane solutions. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.